Good evening. This is Jim Werbenoth again. I'd like to talk to you about America's three chief rivals, at least as I see them, and give you my assessments of their relative power and threat capability against the United States, and show whom we should be worried about the most. So please sit back, relax, and thank you again for watching my video. I have some starting points here that, of course, being starting points, I'd like to start with. First of all, let's look at these powers as rivals and opponents, not necessarily short-term enemies with whom we are going to go to war or anything. That's a possibility, and I really hold to Cicero's maxim of si vis pacem, para bellum. If you want peace, prepare for war. At the same time, don't go making self-fulfilling prophecies of rivalries turning into conflict. And these three are the ones that I find to have the most capacity for troublemaking and can do us the most harm. And there are some I'm going to tell you here not on the list. Venezuela, they're an inconvenience. At best, you have a crooked president running a drug cartel. They make a lot of noise. They have a lot of oil. But I do not see them as a primary enemy or rival or opponent of the United States. If anything, their power is dropping precipitously due to mismanagement and unnecessary confrontation with the United States, which the United States has recently begun pushing back upon. So let's take Venezuela off the list. North Korea has been very quiet for a long time. Every once in a while they rattle a saber, send off a missile, but they're not really that important. The Taliban are off the table pretty much. They're back to misruling Afghanistan, and we do not have any significant points of conflict with them. So we're really down to three major powers here that the United States should be worried about, and which I hope American foreign policy continues to deal with in a robust and sagacious manner. And in this rivalry, as I said, it's not about head-to-head military confrontation nearly as much as competition for power and influence. Who's going to be the big dog? Who is going to have the most influence over other countries, access to materials, markets, all the usual suspects. But again, it's competition. It's not conflict, but it could go that high. And this is not something, too, that is necessarily inimical to cooperation and engagement, as we will see for at least two of the powers I will be examining. So we can have grounds for cooperation. We can have grounds for a mutually beneficial relationship while maintaining competition. Now, there are decisive factors, and this is power. They're all related to power, but they're not necessarily military power. Economic power is pretty close to the top. That a country that is capable of producing products that people want, can trade, is willing to lend money, is willing to give money in terms of foreign aid. Economic power is sometimes underrated, I think, by people who are ignorant of economics, and maybe you're overly focused on military power and political rhetoric. But money talks, and economic power is power, just like any other form. Political power, credibility, the ability to make friends and influence people, often coupled with economic power. They become dependent on each other, mutually supporting, and military power ties in with that too. Um, you want guns, you want modern weapons, you want a large army, air force, navy. You got to pay for that. That requires economic power of some sort, or possibly great power assistance. But you're not going to just do this with smoke and mirrors. Let's look at Russia first, the Russian Federation under Vladimir Putin. The United States and the Soviet Union were allies in World War II. There was a lot of cooperation, but not nearly as much as the United States would have wanted. The United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union did synchronize military operations. For example, the Soviets launched the destruction of the German Army Group Center through Operation Bagration immediately after D-Day in July of 1944. That the Normandy invasion actually set the table for an even greater victory on the Eastern Front in Belarus by the Red Army. The United States and Britain, too, supplied the Soviets with arms, with ammunition, with combat boots. American, British, and other sailors died bringing aid to the Soviet Union. Meanwhile, the Soviets absorbed upwards of 27 million cash dead in World War II. It's 27 million. And they engaged upwards of 85% of the Wehrmacht's combat strength. It's one of my best professors at Duquesne University, Dr. Bob Baranek, the late Dr. Bob Baranek, used to say that in World War II, the United States supplied the weapons and the Soviets supplied the blood. And this is something that I don't think we can underestimate, especially the death toll to the Soviet Union and its component nationalities while fighting the Germans. That the Soviet Union and Russia were deeply traumatized by this, and it's something that is really etched into their DNA. From 1947, with the advent of the Truman Doctrine opposing Soviet assertiveness in the Eastern Mediterranean, to 1991, we had the Cold War, with the United States and Soviets engaging in intense competition, basically of all sorts, economic, diplomatic, and military. Although not directly coming to blows on the battlefield, this was a bitter, long-lasting competition that only ended with the fall of the Soviet Union on Christmas 1991. We were rivals, and the United States stepped up in this in 1947 when Greece and Turkey were subject to Soviet assertiveness, if you will, especially Greece, which was faced with a Soviet-sponsored communist insurgency. And in the Greek Civil War, the Greeks had traditionally looked to the British for support. And in fact, in 1944, when the Germans evacuated from Greece, threatened by the Soviet army, it was the British that moved into Greece. And following that, there was a conflict between traditional royalist resistance groups and the socialists. This became the Civil War after World War II. But in 1947, Britain said that they could no longer support Greece and Turkey as they had because they could no longer afford it. Britain was a country that came through World War II. You could say they won World War II and lost the peace because of economic bankruptcy. The United States steps in, nature abhors a vacuum, the United States steps in with packages of aid for both countries and an open-ended commitment to support countries that oppose Soviet aggression or local communist insurgency. So here we have the United States taking over an imperial commitment from an empire that can no longer function as such. Now, through all of this, even though the United States and Russia, the successor state to the Soviet Union, the Russian Federation, are in competition, we still have an ongoing cooperation through the International Space Station program. What people sometimes don't seem to see is that every cosmonaut has to become fluent in English, and every American astronaut has to become fluent in Russian. This is a joint operation with other countries, including Canada, Japan, the European Space Agency, but the United States and Russia are the prime movers. And for a time, until SpaceX was able to step up to the plate, Russia was the only country that could bring cosmonauts and astronauts to the International Space Station through the Baikonur Cosmodrome in Kazakhstan. So we have this massive scientific project that is dependent on cooperation between the United States and Russia. Regardless of what goes on Earth, we have to cooperate, and we do, to keep this going. Now, the primary area of conflict today between the United States and Russia is, of course, Ukraine and the special military operation. Russian military power has been profoundly embarrassed in Ukraine. This is a discussion I've had with people over the last couple of years, and that is the fact that Ukraine is still there. Zelensky is still president, shows that Russia is losing. Ukraine does not have to have a victory parade through the middle of Red Square. They just have to stay in the ballgame. They have to stay alive. Russia, on the other hand, has to thoroughly defeat Ukraine in an unequivocal manner and assert its will and its power over the Ukrainians. Those victory conditions have not been achieved, and I don't see them being achieved any time in the short run. The Russian military has not done well. If they had, they would have been in Kyiv right by now. They've shown some incredibly poor tactics and lack of commitment to combined arms, especially at the beginning. And I think they've been sometimes a little slow on the uptake when it comes to adopting really effective drone warfare, that the Ukrainians are ahead of them on that. And the Ukrainians have shown a strong ability to compete on the battlefield that personally I did not fully expect. They have shown a lot more determination, stamina, and adaptability. The Russians, not as much. So their special military operation, as Putin calls it, has failed. And in the meantime, there have been a number of embarrassments, like the sinking of the cruiser Moskva by cruise missiles launched from Ukraine, the use of Ukrainian drones launched from 18-wheeler aircraft carriers to attack the Russian strategic bomber fleet throughout the country. It wasn't just in border areas like Belgorod and Kursk. It was into Siberia and the Far East and up north into the Arctic. Definitely a sign of Ukrainian creativity and inventiveness. And it definitely, as well as a profound embarrassment for the Russians. They've had massive expenditures in men and machines, and this may sound counterintuitive, but the Russians have actually run low on manpower. Who ever heard of a Russian military that started running out of troops? Mass quantities of soldiers have long been a traditional Russian asset. They're running low here, which has sparked the use of some really desperate measures. Recruiting prisoners out of the penal system, for starters, bringing in North Koreans who proved to be less than vaunted on the battlefield. High casualties, low results. But Russia is running out of troops. And as much as they try to recruit, they use propaganda, they draft, they reach into the prisons, reach into other countries. They're about reaching their limit, I would say. And that goes for machines too. They're running out of tanks, and their tank production has come nowhere near to meeting the demands of battle or making up for tank losses. Now, besides soliciting manpower overseas, they've had to go for ammunition elsewhere, hat in hand, to North Korea. They've gotten drones from Iran. At one time, the Russians were the ones who were the cornucopia of weapons and with it influence over their neighbors. Now it's Russia going hat in hand to some of the same countries, looking for help to make up for their own failures in Ukraine. So this has been a massive failure. Additionally, too, I'd like to add that this attempt to scare neighbors into becoming allies has backfired on them, and that neutrals have turned on Russia and joined NATO. Sweden, which has had a long-term tradition of neutrality, is now a NATO member. Finland, which was vaguely pro-Soviet during the Cold War while maintaining democratic institutions at home, is now a member of NATO, adding a long border between a NATO country and Russia. Previous to this, the only post-Soviet border that Russia shared with a NATO country was quite a small one off near the North Cape of Norway. Now they've got a big long one with Finland, once an ally, once an enemy, and formerly an ally of Nazi Germany as well. So this is a step backwards for Russian security and power, that they have alienated neutral neighbors into becoming allies of the United States and NATO. Not a good move. It's counterproductive. At one time, this was an ally of both the United States and Israel under the final Shah, Mohammed Reza Pahlavi. But this all changed with the Islamic Revolution of 1979 and the subsequent hostage crisis of 1979 to 81, which was an act not just against diplomats, but a direct challenge to the United States, which, unfortunately for his administration and the United States, Jimmy Carter did not meet effectively. But as soon as Ronald Reagan was inaugurated into office, the hostages were released, but the hostile relationship between Iran and the United States persisted. Then there was the Iran-Iraq War of 1980 to 1988, when Iran was invaded by Iraq under Saddam Hussein. Now, Saddam might have been a complete thug and bastard, but in this case, he was our thug and bastard. That, as bad as he was, the United States gave at least tacit support to Saddam Hussein and the Ba'ath Party. And sometimes it was more than that. I think it really goes to the idea of that saying credited to the Arabs that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And Iran was the enemy, and though the aggressor, Iraq was their enemy and therefore our friend. We do have the scheme, the Iran-Contra scheme in here, where the United States attempted through this convoluted, complex plan to supply Iran with TOW anti-tank missiles from Israeli stocks, which would be replenished by the United States in exchange for more hostages that were held by Iran's proxies in Lebanon. It didn't work. It blew up in the Reagan administration's face. By some scholars' analysis, it made Ronald Reagan impeachable. The Teflon president almost lost his Teflon over this. But even through this insane attempt at cooperation, Iran remained the enemy, something I wish that Oliver North had borne in mind a little more, and so did his boss, National Security Director John Poindexter. Now, Iran had aspirations for leadership of the Islamic world, that they were going to take over and assert themselves at the expense, particularly, of Saudi Arabia. The monarch of Saudi Arabia refers to himself as the guardian of the two shrines, Mecca and Medina, which brings a whole lot of prestige. And Saudi Arabia further controls the quotas of Muslims making the Hajj to the two shrines, and they are the gatekeepers. This is a source of immense political and religious power that Iran wanted to take over. And there was an Iranian-sponsored terrorist attack on the Grand Mosque in Mecca soon after the Iranian Revolution, which the Saudis put down. But I got to give Iran an A for effort and an F for results, because for the most part they did not achieve their goal. Being Shiites trying to reach out to a Sunni world, it was probably doomed from the beginning. So they pulled their horns in a little bit and went to a more power-oriented approach towards their neighbors in the Middle East. And this includes aspirations to become a nuclear power. Iran had a working nuclear research and development program that was established with the help of A.Q. Khan, the Pakistani scientist who developed their bomb and then basically ran a Walmart for nuclear technology to enrich himself. But Iran had aspirations to become a nuclear power, just like Pakistan, just like North Korea became, and just like the United States, Russia, China, Britain, and France, that this would put them in the major league of at least regional superpowers. Now, there were some attempts at rapprochement under Barack Obama and President Joe Biden, but there are virtually no grounds of cooperation between Iran and the United States. We don't have an Iranian-American International Space Station, for example. We don't have a common enemy that we are going to be cooperating against using great power realpolitik theory. We just don't have any converging interests here, and nothing but diverging interests that generate hostility. I do not consider the attempts at rapprochement under the last two Democratic administrations to be either well advised or effective. We got nothing out of it except it really alienating the Saudis and other Sunni Arab states in the Persian Gulf. Bad idea. Next time, guys, don't even try. Now, one of the methods that Iran used to assert itself and to guarantee its national security is through what they term the axis of resistance. This is resistance to Israel and the United States. Hamas is the most prominent of late. The Sunni Muslim branch of the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood that took power in Gaza. The West Bank remains controlled by the Palestine Authority, which is derived from the old Palestine Liberation Organization, the PLO, that Yasser Arafat founded. But Hamas is different. They're more religiously based. They are a branch of the Muslim Brotherhood. And though Sunni Muslim, they are allied with Shiite Iran. And they had their, again, extremely self-destructive, ill-advised October 7th attack on Israel. I don't know what they were thinking in terms of their own interests. The only interests that I saw it serving were Iran's in order to derail a possible reconciliation between Israel and Saudi Arabia. But Hamas effed around and they found out. They brought the full might of the Israel Defense Forces on top of them, and all they really had to fight back with was propaganda and I believe basically fake stories of genocide. I don't believe anything that comes out of their mouths. But they destroyed their own people, they destroyed their own country, they destroyed their own infrastructure, and got nothing out of it. Iran maybe did. Hamas, the Palestinians, no. It blew up in their faces. Iran also sponsored the Shiite militia come political party in Lebanon, Hezbollah, the Party of God. And Hezbollah became a state within a state, an armed force that was actually stronger than the Lebanese military, was able to carve out a fight for themselves in Beirut and in points south especially. They were a power broker in the Lebanese parliament. They delivered social services, and they were the state within a state, and they served Iran. Now, while Israel was fighting Hamas, they turned on Hezbollah. They, through a number of means, ground offensive, airstrikes, missile strikes, and of course the infamous episodes of the walkie-talkies and pagers. They managed to sell both to Hezbollah, and on one signal they all started exploding in people's pockets with predictable and painful results. Hezbollah is not the power that it was, and they don't have the leaders that they used to because Israel, again, they messed around and they found out. I see Hezbollah as a shadow of what it was before the last Israeli offensives. That they're not, if Lebanon wants to, they could disarm them, and there's really nothing to make them much of a power broker anymore except maybe old glories and reputation. Then there were the Houthi rebels in Yemen who threatened the Red Sea and access to the Suez Canal. Again, Israel and then the United States did a number on them. The Houthis are still there. But again, they've been defeated, and I don't see them growing back very fast. Now, you look at this tripartite axis of resistance. Iran has suffered a real bloody nose there. One could say a number of bloody noses, and it's in disarray. And this main component of Iranian security has been neutralized both by the United States and its allies and Israel. Coupled with that is the destruction of Iran's nuclear program by the United States this year. Um, Iran had a little visit from those nice men and women at Whiteman Air Force Base, um, the stealth bombers and bunker busters. Now, there is some debate about the scale and scope of the destruction, but if it hasn't totally eliminated the Iranian nuclear program, it has set it back in a decisive manner by years. And I am not sure that the Iranians can ever recover what was lost in those airstrikes. And no matter how much the current supreme leader brags about it, there were no losses to the Americans. It was one-sided. Iran got its clock cleaned by a modern, efficient, and totally unseen until it was too late United States Air Force. Yeah, that didn't work out well for Iran. And it all started off with a badly calculated instigation of hostilities with Israel through Hamas, and just escalated and escalated. And while Americans might look at escalation in terms of the Vietnam War as counterproductive, here it was counterproductive for the Iranians, not for the United States. And personally, I would not want to be an ally of Iran at this point. If I were, I'd be making up my will just in case a Hellfire missile or a drone was going to come through my window, as happened with the leadership of Hamas and Hezbollah and the Houthis. Iran has become somewhat toxic, and this is not to their advantage, of course, and it makes them a less than intimidating rival of the United States and its allies. Third power here for consideration is the People's Republic of China. They are a competitor for economic and political influence throughout the world with the United States and with its allies. Central to this really is the Belt and Road Initiative, where the Chinese sell infrastructure to especially developing countries. They build railroads, they build airports, they build ports, and they offer loans to pay for it. This puts a Chinese presence in a lot of countries. And in some ways, I see Belt and Road almost as a case of loan sharking. That China has two advantages here. If the country is able to pay off their loans, great. China gets infrastructure. They get influence. If they can't, then China repossesses them. And China has an even stronger presence in these countries. That I don't think it's a good idea to sign on with Belt and Road unless you're China. And it's an especially assertive economic policy. It comes across as foreign aid, and in the long run, I'm not sure it is. But it's something to take into consideration. Now, China has been a rival of the United States since the People's Republic was declared at the end of their civil war in 1949, and there were open hostilities in Korea from 1950 to 1953. China basically saved North Korea in that war. The United Nations forces, led by the United States, had reached the Yellow River. China did warn the United Nations it was going to intervene through the Indian ambassador in Beijing, who relayed it, of course, back home and then to the United Nations, who chose not to believe it. And this amounted to a massive failure of political and military intelligence in Washington, in Tokyo at General MacArthur's headquarters, and in Korea. And it was a total wake-up call, especially as Chinese intervention resulted in some of the greatest defeats ever suffered by the United States Army. Marines did a little better, but the Army was at times humiliated by the ability of these lightly armed Chinese infantry to get behind them, to attack from the flanks and the rear, and destroy entire divisions. So China had success with open warfare against the United States, and you really can't paint lipstick on that pig from an American point of view. They beat us, at least for a time. Now, China and the United States remained hostile towards each other, but in 1972, Richard Nixon played the China card, as it were, and made a visit to the People's Republic, met Chairman Mao, Premier Zhou Enlai, and it was the start of a long-term reconciliation. This was not because Richard Nixon was in love with the People's Republic and wanted to have their baby or anything. It was out of pure realpolitik, great power calculation that too many people saw China and the Soviet Union as two halves of the same communist coin, and they were essentially united, even though they had fought a very nasty border war in 1969, and there had been a breakdown in relations starting with Mao Zedong's first trip to Moscow to meet Joseph Stalin. Those are two scorpions in a bottle, and their relationship was always fraught, and it was always one of competition, which I think some people were afraid to see, or they just didn't see it at all. Richard Nixon, for all of his faults, and they were legion, had the wisdom and the foresight to see that these were not joined at the hip, that China was a power in and of itself, that the United States could have a reconciliation with, and while not becoming allies, we could at least be aligned against the Soviet Union to drive the Soviet Union to make reconciliation possible, détente with the United States. It was, I think it was the high point of Nixon's presidency, and it was something that maybe only as strong an anti-communist as he was could pull off. I keep on thinking of the Vulcan proverb from the Star Trek movies. Only Nixon can go to China. Only a conservative, anti-communist, red-baiting president could do that without looking like he was appeasing communism. But this is a very important event. And no matter how you look at it, the start of reconciliation between the People's Republic of China and the United States of America to the detriment of the Soviet Union. The People's Republic was only formally recognized as the government of China by the United States in 1979. This was at the expense of the Republic of China, Taiwan, sometimes today called Chinese Taipei by people who don't want to admit that Taiwan is an actual independent country run by the Kuomintang and Chiang Kai-shek. This was the regime driven off the mainland by the People's Republic in the communists in 1949. Now, the United States still supports Taiwan. We still act towards their security, but they are no longer considered by the United States to be the legitimate government of China. And whatever relations we have with them are below the level of an embassy. That they're a country that we treat as not a country, And the United States and China agreed that Taiwan is a breakaway province, not a country in and of itself. Yeah, it gets complicated. Now, since 1979, really since 1976, with the death of Chairman Mao, one of the darkest figures in human history, China came out of its shell and developed into an economic powerhouse. It is now the world's second biggest economy, passing Japan, second only to the United States. They have a growing research and development capability. I think this is best exhibited through their growing dominance of the world electric car market. They don't churn out clones of the Tesla. They churn out their own cars with sometimes superior battery technology. This is something that they've basically done on their own, and they have acquired technology from overseas. It's part of the deal. If you work in China, you have to turn over intellectual property, but they've built on it very effectively. It's no longer just this mass of unskilled workers anymore. Technologically, scientifically, they are a power to be reckoned with. And also, as has been expressed through a lot of American elections, the United States is dependent on China for much of its manufacturing needs. That if you're a war gamer, most every game you're going to buy says made in China on it somewhere. There are very few game companies that still manufacture in the United States. They offshore it to China. You get an iPhone, comes from China, from Foxconn. We have American companies of every sort outsourcing to Chinese vendors. It has become a major political issue, and for good reason, as Americans, especially in the manufacturing sector, have lost their jobs. And this dependence on China has become alarming because even the American defense industry is increasingly dependent on Chinese goods and materials. And sometimes, too, Chinese services and products can amount to a national security compromise. This is something that I think is a legitimate concern, that the United States and its allies in Europe and Japan especially should be repatriating a lot of their manufacturing capability and not just relying on the lower costs that China offers. And this is a major part of Chinese power. Coupled with that is China's dominance of rare earth minerals, which are needed for every sort of electronics. Rare earths aren't that rare. They can be found all over the world, but China has really a stranglehold on the supply at the moment. Hopefully that will change, but this is Chinese leverage that the rest of the world probably should be concerned about. With all of this, China has been growing its military power. At one time, China it was a power of great mass and lower quality. Now it's improving. You can think of human wave attacks in Korea attacking at night, not having artillery, except what they captured from the Kuomintang and Nationalist Army. Even in 1969, they put Chinese manpower against Soviet firepower. Lower quality equipment, basically Russian knockoffs. Often their military was crippled by excessive political intrusion, especially during the Great Cultural Revolution. Mao's Little Red Book was not going to teach you how to drive a tank, but still they emphasized that it was more important to be read rather than an expert. expert became an insult. Well, expert is what brings you quality. With the advent of Deng Xiaoping's leadership after Mao's death, they reversed this. They went on a tear of acquiring technology, developing technology, stressing expertise over ideological purity. And it's really shown through in their military as well as economic research and development. They're not churning out cheap crap anymore. If they go to war, it's not going to be with yesterday's technology or the 1950s. It's going to be with something more competitive on a modern battlefield. This includes growing the numbers, especially in their Air Force and Navy. The Army was never a problem. They had vast manpower resources, the kind that Russia used to have, but now they're expanding the power of their Air Force and Navy, including with missile technology, nuclear submarines, aircraft carriers, to become more competitive in the air and on blue water with the United States. This should be an area of concern. Not just the intentions, but the capabilities to go through with those intentions. They can really leave a mark on their enemies. With that, they have been expanding into the South China Sea through a series of artificial islands with port facilities and airfields that they've been building over the last few years. This is not directly pointed at the United States, but is more at their neighbors who are either allies of the United States or aligned with it. For example, the Philippines is an ally of the United States. Vietnam officially isn't, but they might as well be. There is enough military cooperation between Vietnam and China, Vietnam and the United States against China, that they are something of a de facto ally. These are the targets of Chinese expansion in the South China Sea. And it's really smart on their part to be challenging weaker countries like the Philippines, as opposed to going right at American strength. And as far as Vietnam goes, yes, they were allies against the United States during the Vietnam War, or as the Vietnamese call it, the American War, as opposed to the French War. But China and Vietnam have 1,000 years of hostility towards each other. They trade, they talk to each other, but they don't have to like each other. Ho Chi Minh probably expressed it most colorfully when he said during the French War, he said, "It's better to smell French shit now than to eat Chinese shit for years." It's that bitter. So this sort of reorders American interests as well as Chinese interests, that the United States now has a very healthy relationship with our old rivals in Hanoi. We have a very deep trading relationship and military cooperation. Who would have thunk it? But it's true. And this is because of local conditions in China and the fact that now Vietnam is becoming more and more concerned with Chinese expansion and assertiveness. So, of these three countries, the winner is China. This is the one that the United States should be most concerned about. I think that they're less openly hostile than Iran is, but they have far, far greater capabilities, and far greater than Russia even. And they have shown a willingness to use their impressive economic power to advance their national security goals, often at the expense of the United States and the West. And this includes engagement with the developing world. I guess we're not allowed to call it the third world anymore, but that's what it was. That China is reaching out beyond its traditional areas of influence, which would be the so-called tributary kingdoms of their imperial period. Think of Korea, Vietnam, Burma, now Myanmar, Thailand. that they're reaching beyond to places like Latin America and Pakistan and India, that their approaches, their scope and scale and their vision are expanding in advance of their power. And this is something that we have to recognize. They do not want to be a regional superpower anymore. They want to be a superpower. No qualifications. And again, the Belt and Road Initiative is central to this. The loan sharking, as I see it at least, and expansion of their interests and their influence into countries that need infrastructure, with the possibility that maybe China will be able to default on those loans. It's a win-win for China no matter what happens. And that assertiveness in the South China Sea. It's really pretty hard in this day and age to openly engage in territorial expansionism against neighbors. This is more of a creeping sort, and expanding maritime influence and control through the very limited expansion of land control, and that land being newly created. It's imaginative, it's innovative, it's something to be taken seriously. Now, the military is ascendant, definitely, but they're untested. Russia's is tested and I believe found wanting. Iran's has been tested and found to be irrelevant. The Iranian military is increasingly under the control of the Iranian Revolutionary Guards Corps, the Pasdaran, which is more ideologically driven than professional. Iran has a lot of potential and they're going backwards. China is going forward. Pay attention to these guys. They are a threat in terms of quality and quantity. And the fact that they're untested shows that they're an unknown quantity, that we have to be prepared, prepare for the worst and hope for the best. And the worst is pretty damn bad. So keep an eye on these guys and treat them as America's most dangerous rival. Take China seriously. They have demonstrated, call it ill intent, assertiveness, and definitely they want to expand their power at the expense of neighbors and the United States, particularly, but not limited to, the Pacific. Okay, what's next? Chinese assertiveness is a product of Xi Jinping. This is the centerpiece of his presidency. That China is no longer looking inward, it's looking outward on a global scale and beyond if you look at their current space program. This is his baby. And President Xi is not about to leave office. He is president for life. The only way he is leaving office is if he is incapacitated, he decides he's had enough, which I doubt, or he dies. I think the third one, natural death in his own bed, is the most likely outcome. When that's going to happen, I don't know. But he's been there for the long term, and he will be in there for the long term. Now, this assertiveness, economic growth, modernization, or attempts to do all three will continue as long as he is in power, basically as long as he stays breathing. Like I said, this is his baby. This defines his time in office. Now, the next leader, who knows? I'm looking at two options here. First of all is continuity. Option A, they continue Xi's approach to security in general and national security. The Belt and Road continues. Growth of the Air Force and Navy continue. Research and development accelerate. We'll see more aircraft carriers, better aircraft, better submarines, and a stronger, if anything, commitment to control of the South China Sea. Um, if you're in the West, the next guy is not going to offer you any respite. Option B, that's a return to the traditional Chinese haughty isolationism of most emperors, where they retreated into the Middle Kingdom and really didn't reach out to the world beyond their immediate so-called tributary kingdoms, like Tibet, now integrated into China, Korea, Vietnam, much to Vietnam's regret, Burma, today Myanmar. Um, but they didn't look towards Europe by any means. They didn't look really even to India or the East Indies. And the example I'm thinking here are the treasure fleets under the Mongol Muslim eunuch Admiral Zheng He that were dispatched from China on missions of power projection. They went as far as Africa, showing the Chinese flag and showing the power of the empire in the early Ming Dynasty. Now, Zheng He brought his fleet home and found out that there was a new emperor who wanted to go the complete opposite direction. He abandoned trading posts in India and the East Indies. He abandoned outreach beyond the immediate sea lanes of China, let alone to Africa. And Zheng He's fleet was burned, and many of the records were destroyed. That China retreated into itself for the next several hundred years. And although China had more contact with the West than, say, Japan or Korea, it was still an isolationist regime. The empire was concerned with its borders and not much beyond the Great Wall. And that was about it. And only in the mid to late 19th century did they start asserting themselves even a little bit and acquiring Western technology, especially for their navy. And then they got totally passed by and outcompeted and outfought by the Japanese. I do believe that option B is a possible outcome. I don't want to say probable at this point, but it's credible. And one of the big impetus for this may be if President Xi sustains a major setback. Say a military confrontation that goes against China, economic recession, depression being even worse, technology that turns out to be flawed. I do believe that COVID was a potential danger to the regime, including through its own miscalculations and bad remedies, such as an insistence on zero COVID, which was incredibly destructive to the economy and to social cohesion, that President Xi definitely miscalculated there. But in the face of a major defeat and perhaps Xi getting overthrown, then, yeah, option B becomes a lot more probable, and a retreat into isolationism. Even you can even look at Mao as an example. For all his talk of worldwide revolution, China was basically inward looking under his regime. And they could be outmaneuvered too when they did reach out. For example, they supported Ho Chi Minh and the Vietnamese communists against the first France and then the United States. And the Vietnamese really took them to town. They played China against the Soviet Union, got assisted by both. And then when it was all over, they turned to the Soviet Union as their sponsor. I think China got taken to the cleaners on that one. I think we may see a return to those days of limited engagement with the outside world, maybe through a few entrepot, especially port areas like Hong Kong, which President Xi has done everything to repress while compromising the entire idea the one country and two systems. So that's my appraisal of America's three most important rivals. I would say China is the one that we have to take most seriously, then Russia, and finally Iran, which is really on the downside. I don't see the Iranian Islamic Republic getting any stronger. I think it's faced with increasing resistance from within, but unlike some Iranian dissidents, I don't see the fall of the Islamic Republic as happening imminently. I might like to see it happen imminently, but it's not going to. So, thank you for viewing. If you enjoyed this, please hit the like button. Please subscribe to my channel and share it with others. If you're a teacher, if you're a professor, feel free to share it with your students. If you're a student, feel free to use it for coursework and cite it as a source. I hope it's been helpful as well as enjoyable for everybody. So thank you for your time, and I'll see you with the next video. Thanks again.